Welcome to a brand new podcast. Ian McLean is a writer and the author of TJ's War. David Blair is an actor and the narrator of the audiobook TJ's War. David and Ian have been listening to their readers and listeners and have decided to turn TJ's War into a movie. And since the story covers the entirety of World War II, the movie will cost at least $50 million. Will David and Ian succeed in their quest? Follow them in this podcast series. We're going to make a $50 million movie.
Going through your research, I suppose, in your 20s, that must have been the bulk of it, 20s and 30s. Was it mostly UK based, or did you start to travel around Europe and elsewhere as well?
There wasn't a lot that was UK based.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So once I started to get an idea of the scale of this, I was having to travel quite long distances, and because I was piecing things together, I was able to get more out of the people that I saw later than I was out of the people I saw earlier on.
Yeah.
Because I was in my discussions with them, I would say, well, this is you're talking. They might refer to it circumstantially, and I will say, well, you're referring to this operation, and they go, things like, oh, you know about that, do
you? Yeah, a little bit.
So,
tell us about some of the places that you went.
Say again.
Tell us about some of the places you went.
Norway. I went to Norway quite a few times.
And who was that to see?
Well, it depended on the times I went across, but I was lucky enough to meet Max Manus. That was very early on, and he was a superman. He got a lot of self-confidence. He didn't suffer from the war at all, and he was very pleased to see me. And my father and Max Manus initially clashed. But I think by the time the war was over, certainly by the time the war was over, I think they were quite good friends. So I got a lot of information from Max Manus. He wasn't, again, he was very happy to talk, but he didn't come under MI6. He didn't come under any of these secrets laws at all. And he introduced me to a number of other people that my father worked with during that time. And so I went round through Oslo and up to where they captured Femmer, and across to where my father was able to get these men early on in the war back off the mountains and back to Scotland. That was fascinating. And it's not quite connected, but there's a place called Lofoten, an island, and there's a museum in there, and it's fascinating. It covers a lot of the war that went on in Norway that very few people know about. And they should know about it, because in many respects, Norway kicked off the war for the UK. It was when Britain realized that the nickel that was supplied to the Germans when you add nickel to steel, you would then produce armored steel, which means that their tanks, especially in those days, were almost impregnable. And all of that nickel came from the north of Norway. And so when the UK realized that, they then sent a task force, including my father, to interrupt that supply of nickel. And this was in March 1940. But in doing that, that's what stirred the Germans to pull out of Poland. I mean, they planned to do it anyway, but seeing Norway come under threat, the Germans rushed out of Poland, went straight up through Denmark, and then across the strait into Norway, and hit the British and the Free Norwegians. They didn't know what was coming. I mean, the British weren't prepared for warfare in Norway. They had arrived there in their normal clothing, and a lot of men never saw active service. They froze to death during the nights in Norway in March and April 1940, and it was disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful that happened. Britain was still running ideas that were even before the First World War. They were still had that kind of mentality, and had no real idea of winter warfare anywhere.
I'm thinking also about the Bermuda bits and the American long, long. I mean, your dad spent over a year in the US, didn't he?
Yeah.
Did you go there to
Yes. Yes. I was in
conduct research? Because
Bermuda.
obviously, dear listener, this is there was the telephone then, but this is well and truly decades before any sort of internet or anything like that. So the world, it's hard to imagine even now, only 20 years later, but it's hard to imagine how unconnected the world was and how far apart all these places were. So I'm assuming it would have been a mixture of letters, finding people, maybe telephoning them and saying, "I'm coming over." How was it? How did it work?
Well, you would never have a long. There was definitely telephones there. They were invented by a Scotsman called Alexander Graham Bell. I'll just throw that
You
in.
all heard about him? Yeah.
But long distance telephone calls, certainly during the war, just pretty much didn't happen. Everything was done by mail. Until the Americans joined the war at the end of 1941, there was still plenty of mail going from America to Germany and back again. Lots of it. And a lot of it contained secret information about Allied movements, especially shipping movements across the Atlantic, which very important intelligence for the U-boats to get so that they could be in the right place to sink these ships as they went past. A man called William Stevenson, he was called The Man Called Intrepid. There's a book called The Man Called Intrepid. He was a Canadian. And
Is that Bill Stevenson?
Bill Stevenson.
Yeah.
And he knew Churchill very well and had decided to set up a MI6 operation in Bermuda because all the aircraft that flew from America to Germany stopped off in Bermuda to refuel. It was one of their stops, and then they stop off again in the Azores and then on through to Germany. While they stopped off in Bermuda, and unknown to anybody apart from a small group of Bill Stevenson and a few other men and about 100 women, all the airmail was taken out of the aircraft and put to the Princess Hotel in Hamilton and searched, opened, looked for microdots and closed up again as if nobody knew, put back in airmail bags and put back onto the aircraft. Now, it could be that the bags of airmail came off one aircraft and went on a different aircraft, but nobody was aware that this was going on. They found lots and lots of secret messages that way.
Yeah.
And so it was a significant part of our intelligence.
And how did you find out about all of this? Did you go there?
Well, I found out about the operation in greater detail by going there. But I knew my father was there. There were a number of sources that were able to tell me that my father had gone to Bermuda and spent some time there and then gone to America and things that had happened there, good and bad. So I spent 2 years in Bermuda myself.
Purely on the basis of this?
I'd gone to Bermuda to research what he got up to, but I went there having found a job. So I worked in Bermuda.
So a bit of both.
At a law firm for 2 years.
Yeah.
And
meanwhile, finding out as much as you could about your dad and what he did there.
And this entire operation. And then what happened in America thereafter, because after Bermuda, of course, he was sent across to New York and Connecticut, the operation that happened there.
And at this point, were you finding people that were still alive?
Yes, yes. I mean, this research, the Bermuda, I went to Bermuda to work much later, but I'd gone there before that on a holiday. And in America, when I was researching in New York and upstate and into Connecticut, that was all in the 80s as well. And at that time, people who'd been in the war, that's only 35 years previously. So they were in the 60s and 70s at that point.
And how long did you spend in the US researching?
On the visit where I went to New York, I was there for a total of 6 months because I spent time in New York, spent time in Connecticut, and then moved across to the west side and actually worked in Los Angeles for 5 months and traveled back and forth. I went all over the place. Even went to Las Vegas.
Who did you see there?
I didn't, that wasn't part of the research, but I find it fascinating. I was sitting with a passenger on the way into Las Vegas and he said, "Now remember when you get off the aircraft, no guts, no glory." So I'd never heard that phrase before. So I went into the Grand Met Hotel with my $1,000 in my hand. That I didn't have anything else. I had my $1,000 in my hand and my plane ticket back to Las Vegas for the following day. And I lost my entire $1,000 scoring no guts, no glory in the first 2 hours.
But you lasted 2 hours.
I lasted 2 hours. And food and drink at that time was free in the casino. So I managed to stay alive, and I couldn't afford a hotel room or anything else. I was just wandering around right throughout the night. And then I had to walk from the hotel back to the airport. I was just about dead by the time I arrived.
What about Italy and Africa? Did you go there?
Africa, I went to nearly 6 months in North Africa. Initially just traveling, and went to the sites where TJ met Montgomery.
Tell me about how you found out that TJ met Montgomery.
Well, my father mentioned a number of people that he'd met, including Churchill and the King and Montgomery. He didn't like Montgomery. He loved Churchill. It's the only time I ever saw my father cry was on the day that he heard that Churchill had died in 1965. So I knew about this story that my father had met Montgomery because my father had mentioned this. I didn't at that time when he was mentioning it to me and to my mum and sister and so on. I didn't think that was to do with the army or anything else. It was just one of those things that he said. My Auntie Jean told me about him going to North Africa. She mentioned that very early on. And then it was a chap, a lot of these people that I talked to never wanted their names mentioned. But there was a chap who, he's mentioned in the book, but I haven't given him his real name. But he was the chap who helped TJ with his bags and took them across to the tent where he met his old friend.
His old roommate.
His old roommate.
I'm
trying not to give too many spoilers to the story.
Throw them in. Throw them in. This one, don't forget, Ian, this is like a 500 or 600 page book, you know. We want the stories and the anecdotes and everything. I think people will love to hear this. And on the strength of this, they'll think, oh, God, I've got to go and buy the book. This is amazing. No, absolutely. So there was someone that asked to have their anonymity kept.
Oh, most people. Most
Really?
people who talk to me on the basis that I wouldn't, their names are kept right out of it. Because at the end of the day, when they were talking to me, they were still under state secrets.
This is what I was alluding to a little bit earlier on with the, you know, they might have been on a personal level, they might have been happy to have talked, but.
And I wasn't asking to get this information to write down a book. I was simply asking for my own benefit.
Yeah. Wow. So that was North Africa. And what about Italy? Who did you meet there?
Gianfranco.
The son of
Contini.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well remembered.
So who are these guys? Who are Gianfranco and his dad?
They became
just very brief outline.
After the war, they became a sort of minor league mafia outfit. I mean, they were during the war, really, but they hadn't started out that way. They basically started out as poor farmers, or a sort of lower end farming family. Through the circumstances of the war and essentially the depravity of the situation they were in, they made ends meet by effectively becoming hitmen. At the same time, having a sense of wanting to regain Italy's freedom.
Were they resistance?
They became Resistenza, yes, but they were already resisting before Resistenza really came into effect. Italy was being run by
Mussolini.
Say again, Mussolini.
Yeah,
a very fascist government, and a bit like Spain. Some people agreed with them, and some people didn't. And so,
well, even at the start of the war, they were allies with Germany, weren't they?
Spain were? Or Italy?
No, Italy, Mussolini.
No, Italy didn't come into the war until a lot of people in Britain tried very hard to keep Italy out of the war. So during the phony war, there was a lot of back and forth, and eventually, I'm not sure exactly when it was, but it was a few months after Britain had declared war that Italy decided to side with Germany. But it was touch and go because Italy was part of the Allies during the First World War. But the country was pretty divided by Mussolini. And Mussolini and Franco in Spain had very similar views on politics to Hitler. So they were quite closely allied to him.
Tell me about Gianfranco. What was he like when you met him?
Well, he's old.
Presumably he remembered TJ.
Oh, I remember TJ very well. Absolutely.
Lots of stories.
Yeah. Lots of stories. And he had a lot of respect for TJ. I mean, there was they seemed to have a very good relationship.
Would they have been of similar age?
They would have been. Gianfranco was a bit older, but they would have been. They would have been similar age, but I think Gianfranco would actually have been younger than TJ.
And just for the viewer, listener, just very briefly, who was Gianfranco?
So his father had established this base in the mountains, having run away from the fascists. Through the church, TJ had been put in touch with these people. The father had learned his killing skills during the First World War as a result of his house coming under attack. His son killed his first person when he was 13 or 14 years old.
And his son being?
Gianfranco. It then became fairly easy for Gianfranco to kill people. And so by the time TJ had met these people, the priest was handing Gianfranco, who described himself at that time as a businessman, contracts, which had been passed on to the priest. Not sure whether the priest knew about it or not, but the contracts were being passed on to the priest from people, from fascists who were not happy with other fascists. And so Gianfranco was going around with a couple of his friends and killing these people and getting paid for it by the fascists.
So he was essentially just a gun for hire.
He was a gun for hire.
This wasn't a politically motivated resistance in the war at this point.
No. And TJ insisted on that stopping and then becoming a more professional unit.
Yeah.
And sometimes he won that battle and sometimes he didn't.
And what was TJ, so again, in brief, in the book, it talks about TJ running off up into the hills every so often to check whether he was receiving orders from home, because he was there on a mission during, can't remember what year, 40, 41?
43.
43.
Yeah.
And he kept on running off to go and find out whether he was receiving any instructions, and he wasn't. He was sort of left to his own devices.
Yeah. Well, his instructions he'd been given before he left the UK. And his instructions were to establish a resistenza and have them ready to attack supply lines, railways and roads and so on, once he was given the signal from HQ. But they knew there was going to be an Allied landing at the south of Italy, and then there would be one at Anzio, and he knew that. So
But it kept getting delayed, didn't it?
It kept getting delayed. There's many books about that, but there were two reasons for the delay. The first was that Salerno, the Americans and the Allies who went in at Salerno just were massacred. I don't think people understand just how bad that was. And so
when was that beforehand?
Salerno happened after TJ had arrived in Italy.
Okay.
So around about August 1943, and the Germans under Kesselring had set up just a withering field of fire onto Salerno, and were mowing people down left, right, and centre. So the Americans especially lost so many men getting onto the beaches of Salerno and making any kind of progress at all, that they weren't going to have any more beach landings in Italy. They decided, that's it, we're not going to do this. We're not going to have the plan of pulling the Germans into the toe of Italy and then moving in across from Anzio to right across to the east and cutting them off, because it's just too expensive in men. We can't do it. And so the Anzio landing that TJ and his men were waiting for kept being delayed and delayed and delayed. And eventually, Contini's men and Contini couldn't wait any longer. They just wanted to go out and fight the Germans, and so off they went. By doing that, they were effectively wiped out. The Germans kept fighting them very easily. Lots and lots of reprisal killings. Villages were wiped out by the Germans in reprisals for minor attacks here and there. And the Allied landing should have happened in September and didn't, and was eventually brought back on the table by Churchill when he recovered from illness. And so the Allied landing actually happened on the 22nd of January 1944, by which point most of the Resistenza had been broken up and killed.
Is there anywhere else? Is there any... We've talked a little bit about Norway, North America, Bermuda, North Africa, Italy.
Austria.
Yes. What about towards the end of the war and some of the horrors that, I mean, particularly Belsen, and when the war was coming to an end and the Germans knew it, was that mostly your research in the last sort of 10, 20 years? Or did you meet people from that period at the end of the war?
No, that was all just, I didn't meet anybody. Well, that's not true. The gravedigger.
Oh,
Tom
McPhee.
Yeah, Tom McPhee.
Yeah.
So he was another chap who gave me a lot of good information.
Yeah.
But he was the only person I met, and Tom couldn't talk about Belsen. It was physically impossible for him to talk about it. There was such an impact.
What was Tom's role at the end of the war around Belsen?
Well, he was the Batman to the commander of the tank. I don't know what you call a bunch of tanks. Tank regiment.
But one of the liberating forces, anyway.
They were the liberating forces for Belsen. Anyway, he was the Batman. He had grown up in Skye, and had my father knew him to some extent. They'd been in the same school together. Tom was a bit older. A massive coincidence. He just happened to be the Batman for the tank's commander. And
in what capacity was TJ there?
TJ was there. He'd been sent there by Stuart Menzies to divert the tanks to go into Belsen. Commander of the tanks didn't want to do that. He had orders to get to a particular target by the end of the week, which came from Montgomery, and that was what he was determined to do. So he wasn't going to go that way. However, things conspired so that typhoid had broken out in Belsen, and the Germans were worried that by all of the fighting going on, there would be no control left of Belsen, and people with typhoid would be allowed to escape left, right, and centre into the local community, and for the disease to spread very quickly. So they'd, under parley with these people, including TJ, they agreed to hand over the land containing Belsen in a wedge shape, and there would be no fighting. The land would be handed over, and the British would take over Belsen. So they were able to go in to Belsen without any major violence taking place, not realizing just quite how bad Belsen was. And it was horrific, of course.
Was it one of the first Belsen to be discovered?
The Americans have found a number.
So word presumably had started to get out already about what was happening in these camps.
Yeah. So I don't think Belsen was the first, but I think the Americans were finding a few, but the British had a famous BBC reporter going with that group, Dimbleby. And he'd got a recording device with him and was describing what he could see as he went into Belsen. So that's why Belsen became really very well known. But it wasn't a death camp. But Belsen had been a holding camp for prisoners.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, the Germans weren't terribly nice. The German commander was eventually executed, but that wasn't for his actions at Belsen. That was for his actions at Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen?
Don't know.
I think that's right. Where he had been a senior officer before, which was a death camp. But when he got to Belsen, that was a holding camp, and it was taking in prisoners from all the other prisons as they were shutting down, because the Allies were, especially the Russians, were coming closer and closer. So those prisons were being closed down, and prisoners were being moved into Belsen. And normally, as prisoners would come into the prison, they'd be deloused and disinfected. But all of that had broken down. The water supply had gone down. So prisoners were coming in with all kinds of diseases, and typhoid was one of them.
Mm. So most of this, presumably, you found out from your own research. If Tom couldn't bring himself to talk about it, Tom McPhee.
Tom described the lead up to Belsen and my father's involvement in that. When I would say ask questions like, "Well, what was it like in Belsen?" he just said no.
Yeah.
No, he just couldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
So yes, as I describe it in Belsen, that's the, as many parts of the book are, that's the creative non-fiction part of the book. Really, it's trying to make those ends meet somehow.
Yeah, and we know an awful lot about it. It's just a matter of creating a narrative through that tells that story. We are rapidly running out of time. I think we will have. I mean, I've got more questions. And I'm sure you've got many more stories to tell. So maybe we can revisit this. Maybe we can have another sort of informal interview, perhaps again soon or at a later date.
Let us see what our listener thinks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this will be fascinating. Well, it has been fascinating. So let's wrap this up. Thank you very much, Ian, for your time. It's been a pleasure and fascinating. And we should also possibly do an ending for the first half as well.
Yes.
Well,
Anyway.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been fascinating talking with Ian. Do subscribe, like, and don't forget to tune in next time.
Bye,
it's
everyone.
Bye from me.
Bye from me.
And it's bye from him.